September 18, 1944. Near the German frontier, General Hasso von Manteuffel stood inside his command post, bent over a map that, for the first time in many months, offered something he had nearly stopped believing in: victory. Manteuffel was 51 years old. He was no ideologue or fanatic. He was a realist, a seasoned practitioner of armored warfare who had fought in both Russia and North Africa. He had watched entire armies disintegrate under pressure. He understood that the Wehrmacht was slowly bleeding out on two fronts. Yet this morning, he was convinced the odds were finally in his favor. Under his authority was the 113th Panzer Brigade. These were not exhausted survivors scraped together from the ruins of Normandy. This unit was Hitler's newly created fire brigade. Fresh, fully equipped formations delivered straight from the factories. The tanks were so new that some crews were still mastering their turret controls. The brigade fielded 58 brand-new Panther tanks, the most lethal armored vehicles on the Western Front. Manteuffel ran the numbers without emotion. The American Sherman was dependable and plentiful, but it remained a medium tank armed with a standard 75mm gun. Its frontal armor could be pierced by a Panther from 2 kilometers away. The Panther's sharply sloped armor could deflect American shells as if they were harmless toys. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where American firepower was effectively useless. He reviewed the fuel figures carefully. The 113th Brigade had received 600,000 liters of fuel, enough for 2 days of sustained combat operations. 2 days were all he required. The objective was simple and precise: strike into the exposed right flank of General George Patton's Third Army. Patton had pushed too far ahead. His fuel supply line stretched more than 400 kilometers. His armored units were spread thin across a front nearly 180 kilometers wide. Manteuffel intended to mass his 58 Panthers and drive straight into the American 4th Armored Division, sever Patton's forward elements, destroy them piece by piece, and trigger a crisis severe enough to bring the entire American advance to a standstill. By every rule of conventional military thinking, the plan should have succeeded. The German tanks were technically superior. Their numbers were tightly concentrated. Surprise was complete. The Americans had no inkling that a fresh Panzer Brigade was forming in the fog-covered forests of Lorraine. But Manteuffel was applying the logic of the early 1940s to the battlefield reality of late 1944. He believed tank combat was decided by armor thickness and gun caliber alone. He did not realize he was steering his brigade into a trap built from 3 factors the German military mindset could not grasp. At 7:30 on September 19th, the forward elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade began their movement toward designated assembly areas. A dense, suffocating fog spread across the fields of Lorraine like a living organism. Visibility collapsed, first to 50 yards, then to 30. Tank commanders strained through their periscopes. Drivers struggled to keep visual contact with the vehicle ahead. Manteufel's greatest strength, the Panther's long-range lethality, vanished in an instant. A 2-kilometer kill shot requires clear sight lines. These Panthers could barely see 50 meters. Hitler's fire brigade was effectively blind. 15 kilometers away, inside the American Combat Command headquarters, Colonel Bruce Clark received the first messages from forward observers. Heavy engine noise, large armor formations, moving west. Clark did not command heavy tanks. His striking force was the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a name that would later be given to America's main battle tank. Abrams did not panic. He immediately understood that the fog had transformed the battlefield into an equalizer, and a devastating one. If the Germans could not engage at long range, their superior firepower meant nothing. This would be close combat, brutal and confined. Reaction speed and coordination would decide everything. The German column pushed forward to the mist, engines thunderous, tracks grinding, commanders crouched inside their cupolas. They expected to smash through the American screening forces and surge into the rear areas. Instead, the lead Panther suddenly burst into flames. Its turret blew outward. Then the second tank was hit. Then the third. Confusion rippled through the column. Radio discipline disintegrated. Tank commanders spun their turrets wildly, searching for flashes in the fog, but they saw nothing. The shots were coming from the sides, American shells slamming into thinner flank armor, striking where the Panthers were most vulnerable. Shells that could not defeat the Panther's thick frontal glacis were slicing through its weaker side armor. Confused German voices filled the radio net. Enemy on the left. No, enemy on the right. Where are they? Commanders lifted their hatches, try and see through the haze, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from unseen positions. The German crews believed they had slammed into a solid barrier of American heavy tanks. The truth was far more unsettling. The 113th Panzer Brigade had not struck a wall. It had stumbled into a swarm. This was the battlefield debut of the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. To a German tanker, the Hellcat seemed almost laughable. It carried virtually no armor. Even heavy machine gun fire could punch through its thin turret. Its open top left the crew vulnerable to shrapnel and grenades. By Wehrmacht standards, where protection was valued above everything else, it looked like a death trap. But the Hellcat possessed one critical advantage that Manteuffel had completely overlooked: power-to-weight ratio. The vehicle weighed just 17 tons. It was driven by a radial aircraft engine, the same class of engine that powered American fighter planes. This remarkable engine produced 350 horsepower. The result was extraordinary speed. On roads, the Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour, faster than any tank on Earth. No Panther, no Tiger, not even the Soviet T-34 could keep up. A Hellcat could change positions faster than a medium tank could traverse its turret. In the fog-shrouded fields of Arracourt, that speed became a decisive weapon. The German Panthers advanced in rigid formation, like Roman legionaries moving in lockstep. They were built to fight as cohesive units, each vehicle guarding the flanks of the others. But such tactics depend on clear visibility and disciplined communication. The fog destroyed both. The American Hellcats fought differently. They moved like a wolf pack, independent hunters, dispersed, coordinated not by visual contact, but by radio. The engagement followed a deadly pattern, repeated again and again that morning. A platoon of Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion would hear the Panthers long before they could see them. Engines rumbling, tracks grinding through the mist. The platoon commander, listening to reports over the radio, would mark the enemy's movement on his map. He would order his driver to sprint toward a flank position, concealed behind a hedgerow or a barn. The engine would howl at full power. The vehicle would skid into position. Guns would be laid. The crews would wait, silent, invisible, and ready. Engines ticking quietly. The gunner's hand rested on the firing lever. The loader stood ready, armor-piercing rounds lined up for a rapid reload. They waited until the German giants rolled past, exposing their vulnerable flanks. Then 3 high-velocity 76mm shells smashed into the side of a Panther. Clean penetration. The Panther's turret lurched as it tried to swing toward the attacker, but the Hellcat was already gone. The driver slammed the engine into reverse at full power. The vehicle raced backward nearly 300 yards at close to top speed, guided by shouted command from the commander. Then it surged off along a different road, over new ground, toward the next ambush site. Before the surviving German tanks could finish traversing their turrets, the Hellcats had disappeared. What followed was not just a battle, but a collision of doctrines. German tanks were built as rolling strongholds, heavy, thickly armored, meant to absorb punishment and keep fighting. American vehicles were designed around a different idea: never be present when the return fire arrived. Light, fast, built to strike and reposition. By midday, the fog began to thin. Manteuffel, receiving reports of stalled advances and increasing losses, ordered his unit commanders to press forward. The Americans cannot be everywhere, break through their screen. But as the sun finally burned away the mist, the Germans discovered the second phase of the American trap snapping shut. During the early hours, German infantry, the Panzer Grenadiers, had ridden atop the tanks or followed close behind in half-tracks, shielding the armor from American foot soldiers. Now, with visibility restored, the sky above Arracourt seemed to rip open. It was not aircraft, not yet, It was something far more exact and far more lethal than anything the German command structure could easily comprehend. American artillery, specifically the 66th Armored Field Artillery Battalion under the direct control of Colonel Bruce Clark, was employing a technique that was routine doctrine within the 4th Armored Division, but devastating in effect. Time on target. In conventional 1940s artillery practice, batteries fired in sequence. Battery A fired first. The enemy heard the incoming shell and reacted, diving for cover. Battery B followed 10 seconds later, but by then the target was already underground. Surprise vanished. After the first rounds landed, lethality dropped by as much as 90%. The American time-on-target system changed all of that. It was nothing but mathematics. A centralized fire direction center calculated the flight time of artillery rounds from 12 separate batteries spread miles apart, positioned at different elevations and varying distances from the target, working backward from a single, exact moment of impact. The FDC determined precise second each battery needed to fire. A battery 12 kilometers away might fire at 1,200 hours. Another 4 kilometers from the target would fire at 12:05. A third, 8 kilometers distant, would fire at 12:10. The calculations were exact. The ballistic tables were reliable. Each gun fired at a different time, yet every shell reached the target coordinates at the same instant. As the fog lifted on September 19th, Piper Cub spotter aircraft, tiny observation planes resembling oversized insects, began circling above the positions of the 113th Panzer Brigade. From the air, the pilots could clearly see the German tank columns below. They transmitted coordinates directly to the artillery. In that moment, they became the eyes of the American fire control system focused on the 113th Panzer Brigade. There was no warning, no ranging shots. One moment, Panzer Grenadiers were advancing across soaked fields. The next, the air above them erupted. Dozens of airburst shells detonated simultaneously at roughly 30 feet above the ground. The effect was catastrophic. Shrapnel fell like a storm of blades. The pressure waves alone were deadly. The Panzer Grenadiers, elite infantry riding on the tanks, were shredded. Scores were killed in the first instant. Many more were wounded. The fragments did not penetrate the Panther's thick armor, but they stripped away something far more critical than steel. The tanks lost their senses. External radios were smashed. Antennas were torn apart. Field telephones were severed. Command and control collapsed in seconds. In an instant, the German tanks were left without their protective screen. Hatches slammed shut. Commanders were blind, sealed inside steel boxes amid detonations. A tank without infantry support is a doomed vehicle. Without infantry to shield them from bazooka teams, the Panthers were exposed. Without commanders observing from open hatches, they could not detect the Hellcats circling their flanks. Without radio communication, they had no understanding of the battlefield around them. Manteuffels' elite formation was no longer fighting a battle. It was being fed into a system designed to break it apart. By the afternoon of September 19th, the ground was scattered with burning Panthers. Yet the most startling figure was not the number destroyed by enemy fire, but the number that simply went nowhere at all. The 111th Panzer Brigade, intended to reinforce the attack of the 113th, arrived late. The reason was brutally simple. They ran out of fuel before reaching the battlefield. Germany had engineered what was arguably the most advanced tank of the war, optical systems superior to anything the Americans fielded, complex interleaved road wheels, sharply sloped armor, and a high-velocity main gun. Yet the Reich could not supply enough fuel to move 58 of these machines even 20 kilometers. At the same time, General Patton was raging about fuel shortages. The Red Ball Express, a non-stop flow of supply trucks, was stretched to its limit. American armored units were placed on fuel restrictions. But this is where the critical difference lay. When American units ran short of fuel, tanks shut down and waited. When the trucks arrived, they refueled and were back in action within hours. When German units ran out of fuel, the tank was lost. Crews destroyed the breach to prevent capture. Engines were disabled. Demolition charges were set. The vehicle was abandoned to sink into the mud. As the fighting continued over 3 days, The contrast became almost absurd. American recovery teams pulled damaged Shermans off the battlefield even as the fighting continued. Mobile repair depots followed the advance. Mechanics worked in open-air workshops under combat conditions, welding plates over shell holes, replacing engines, straightening bent gun tubes. Tanks knocked out in the morning were refueled, recrewed, and back in the fight by nightfall. The Germans had nothing comparable. They possessed no effective recovery capability. If a Panther threw a track, it was left behind. If the transmission failed, abandoned. If the engine caught fire, the crew bailed out and the tank burned. There was no replacement system, no steady flow of spare engines or factory support. The 113th Panzer Brigade went into the battle with 58 Panthers. Within 24 hours, 30 were gone. Within 48 hours, 50 were lost. By the end of the week, only 8 remained operational. In contrast, the U.S. 4th Armored Division suffered comparatively light losses. Combat Command A lost 5 Sherman tanks and 3 tank destroyers during the critical first day, and continued the advance. Total American losses for the week amounted to roughly 25 tanks and tank destroyers. The critical point, however, was replacement speed. Within 3 days, new Sherman tanks were already arriving from the rear. Within a week, Combat Command A's operational strength was arguably greater than it had been at the start of the fighting. Patton was not defeating Manteuffel through battlefield tactics alone. He was defeating him with an industrial and logistical system that stretched across the Atlantic, through English ports, back to American factories in Michigan, New Jersey, and Ohio, back further to the iron ore mines of Pennsylvania, and the oil refineries of Texas. Manteuffel had forged a near-perfect hammer, but the forge that produced those hammers lay 3,000 miles away and was constrained by Hitler's ration economy. On September 22nd, Manteuffel ordered the 113th Panzer Brigade to disengage and withdraw. The much-vaunted counterattack was over. The final tally was merciless. The brigade entered combat with 58 brand-new Panther tanks. By the end of the week, German records showed only 8 still operational. As a combat unit, the brigade had effectively been destroyed. By contrast, American Combat Command A reported losses of approximately 25 tanks and tank destroyers, losses that were replaced within days. The kill ratio did not represent a contest. It was an annihilation. Arracourt demonstrated a fundamental truth. Even a superior weapon like the Panther becomes ineffective when it is blind, deprived of infantry support, immobilized by fuel shortages, and outmaneuvered by swarms of lighter vehicles operating with superior coordination and logistics. The Germans built armored knights, powerful, heavily protected, and individually formidable. The Americans built a moving factory, traveling at 50 miles per hour, equipped with radios, sustained by supply trucks, stocked with spare engines, ammunition, and fuel. And in September 1944, in the fog of Lorraine, the factory prevailed. General Manteuffel survived the war. In his memoirs, he acknowledged that American time-on-target artillery and the mobility of tank destroyer units had rendered traditional Panzer tactics obsolete. The Battle of Arracourt is often overlooked, overshadowed by D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. It lacks the dramatic scale of those campaigns. Yet it may be the most instructive engagement for understanding why Germany lost a war, not because of its size, but because it exposes the deeper truth beneath the surface. It was never simply about bravery. Courage existed on both sides. German soldiers were no less valiant than their American counterparts. What decided the outcome was the dominance of a system, a logistical system, a communications network, an industrial engine, a system in which speed, mobility, interchangeable vehicles, and readily available spare parts outweighed individual acts of battlefield heroism. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep examination of how wars are actually won, how logistics and tempo overcame superior armor, please like and subscribe for more overlooked stories from World War II. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you rather command a heavily armored Panther with no fuel, or a lightly protected Hellcat with unmatched speed? Let us know where you're watching from, and tell us which World War II stories you'd like us to explore next. Your support helps us continue uncovering the forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe for more untold World War II narratives, and the real lessons of industrial warfare. We tell history through the experiences of those who lived it. German commanders learning that bravery alone could not overcome systems. Japanese officers realizing that tactical brilliance meant little against industrial power, and American soldiers discovering that wars are ultimately decided in factories, not just on battlefields. Keep history alive. We'll see you in the next episode.